Young woman with no choice, forced to marry a gay millionaire to save her family. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The steam rising from the industrial dishwasher couldn't mask the smell of burning dreams. And Carter stood in the kitchen of Carter's Corner, the family restaurant that had been her sanctuary since childhood, now transformed into a prison of mounting bills and broken promises. Her fingers traced the edge of yet another final notice, the paper trembling slightly in her grip. "Mom!" she called out, her voice barely rising above the clatter of dishes and the dying wheeze of the ancient ventilation system. "Can we talk?" Linda Carter emerged from the walk-in freezer, still as graceful as ever, despite the worry lines etched deeply around her eyes. She wore the same apron she'd worn for the past 15 years, now faded and frayed at the edges, much like their hopes for the restaurant's future. "Sweetie, I'm just doing inventory. Can it wait?" Linda's smile was bright but brittle, a practiced mask that Anne had watched perfect itself over months of declining customers and mounting debt. Anne held up the notice, watching her mother's smile falter. "The bank called again. They're not just threatening anymore, Mom. They're moving forward with foreclosure on everything. The restaurant, the house." She swallowed hard. "How bad is it, really?" The silence that followed felt heavier than all the unpaid bills combined. Linda sank onto a nearby prep stool, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I tried everything, Anne. The refinancing, the second mortgage, even that private investor who promised to turn things around." She pressed her palms against her eyes. "Almost 2 million, with interest." The number hit Anne like a physical blow. 2 million. "Mom, how?" "I thought I could save it," Linda whispered. "Your father built this place with his own hands. After he died, I couldn't bear to let it go. Every loan, every new debt. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd turn things around." Anne moved closer, wrapping her arms around her mother's shoulders. The familiar scent of Linda's vanilla perfume, mixed with kitchen spices, the smell of home, of childhood, of security, now seemed to mock them both. At 22, Anne had put her own dreams of college and travel on hold to help with the restaurant, but she'd never imagined the depth of their financial crisis. "We'll figure something out," Anne promised, even as her mind raced through their non-existent options. Their regular customers, mostly families who'd been coming to Carter's Corner for years, had dwindled as newer, trendier restaurants opened in downtown Boston. The neighborhood was changing, gentrifying, and their simple family restaurant was becoming a relic. "The creditors gave us 30 days. Linda's voice cracked. "After that, they'll take everything." Anne stepped back, her gaze sweeping across. The kitchen where she'd learned to cook, where her father had taught her to make his secret recipe meatballs, where every surface held a memory she wasn't ready to lose. "I'll get another job, maybe 2. We can sell my car." "Honey?" Linda stood, taking Anne's hands in hers. "This isn't something a few extra shifts can fix. I've failed us both, and I'm so sorry." The dinner rush would start soon. Already, their longtime cook Pablo was firing up the grills, pretending not to hear the conversation. Anne squeezed her mother's hands once before letting go, moving to tie on her own apron. "We still have time," she said, more firmly than she felt. 30 days is better than nothing." But as she moved through her shift that evening, serving familiar faces and memorizing new orders, a cold reality settled over her. The regulars left generous tips, perhaps sensing their struggles, but kindness wouldn't save them now. They needed a miracle. She was wiping down tables after closing when she spotted the newspaper someone had left behind. The business section was folded open to a story about Boston's real estate boom, featuring a photo of the Sinclair family empire. Anne's attention caught on the younger man in the image, Nathan Sinclair, heir to the vast Sinclair fortune whose grandfather Howard had apparently announced some unusual stipulations about his inheritance. Anne almost threw the paper away, but something made her pause. The article mentioned rumors about a deadline, about conditions that had to be met, about billions at stake. She found herself reading it twice, then a third time, an impossible idea taking root. Later that night, after her mother had gone to bed, Anne sat at their small kitchen table with her laptop, researching everything she could find about Nathan Sinclair and his family's empire. The more she read, the more her desperate plans seemed simultaneously absurd and possible. They needed money. He needed something else entirely. Anne closed her laptop, her heart pounding. She was no one, a waitress from a failing family restaurant. But desperation had a way of breeding courage, or perhaps madness. Tomorrow, she decided, she would find a way to meet Nathan Sinclair. After all, she had nothing left to lose. The Sinclair Tower pierced the Boston skyline like a glass sword, its reflective surface throwing back the morning light. Anne stood across the street clutching her mother's best handbag, borrowed without permission, and wondering if she'd completely lost her mind. Her sensible black dress, purchased for funeral services years ago, suddenly felt woefully inadequate among the stream of impeccably dressed professionals entering the building. Security stopped her, of course. The guard at the front desk looked at her the way one might regard a lost puppy, with a mixture of pity and mild annoyance. Mr. Sinclair doesn't take unscheduled meetings. Please, Anne said, forcing her voice steady. I have a business proposition that could benefit us both. The words sounded rehearsed, probably because she'd practiced them 100 times in front of her bathroom mirror that morning. You and everyone else in Boston, the guard replied, already reaching for the phone to presumably call for escort services. That's when fate, or desperation, intervened. The elevator doors opened, and Nathan Sinclair himself stepped out, engrossed in conversation with an older man in an expensive suit. Anne had memorized his face from photos, but they hadn't done him justice. Tall and commanding, he carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who'd never worried about paying bills or losing their home. Before the guard could stop her, Anne stepped directly into Nathan's path. Mr. Sinclair, I need 5 minutes of your time. The older man bristled, but Nathan held up a hand, studying Anne with cool interest. And you are? Anne Carter. I have a solution to your inheritance problem. The temperature in the lobby seemed to drop 10 degrees. The older man, who Anne would later learn was Gregory Walsh, the family's longtime lawyer, moved to intervene, but Nathan's curiosity was clearly piqued. My inheritance problem? His voice was carefully neutral, but Anne caught the slight tightening around his eyes. I wasn't aware that was public knowledge. It's not entirely, Anne admitted, but rumors spread, and I pay attention. She took a deep breath. I know your grandfather gave you a deadline. I know there are conditions. I can help. Nathan glanced at his watch, then at Walsh, who was practically vibrating with disapproval. 5 minutes, he said finally, in my office. The elevator ride to the penthouse offices was silent and tense. Anne's heart hammered so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The doors opened to a reception area larger than her entire house, all chrome and glass and power. Nathan's private office offered a panoramic view of the city. Anne could see Carter's corner from here, a tiny speck in the distance. The sight strengthened her resolve. Your 5 minutes started when we left the lobby, Nathan said, settling behind his massive desk. Walsh remained standing, arms crossed, and didn't sit in the offered chair. Instead, she placed both palms on Nathan's desk and met his gaze directly. You need to be married within the month to inherit your grandfather's fortune. I need $2 million to save my family from complete ruin. I'm proposing a business arrangement that solves both our problems. The silence that followed was deafening. Walsh sputtered something about security, But Nathan held up his hand again, his expression unreadable. Continue. A marriage of convenience, Anne said. 1 year, maybe 2, whatever your grandfather's requirements are. You get your inheritance, I get enough to save my family's restaurant and home. When it's over, we go our separate ways. This is preposterous, Walsh interjected. Mr. Sinclair, I must insist. Gregory, Nathan said softly, give us the room. The lawyer's face reddened, but he complied, closing the door with perhaps more force than necessary. Nathan stood, moving to the window. What makes you think I'd consider such an arrangement? Because you're running out of time, Anne said, and because I'm your best option. I have no connections to Boston's high society, no ambitious family. Pushing for a real merger, I'm nobody, which means I have nothing to gain from exposing the truth. She paused, and I'm desperate enough to keep any secret. He turned to face her, and for the first time Anne saw something crack in his perfect facade. You have no idea what you'll be getting into. I know exactly what I'm getting into, Anne countered. A business deal, nothing more. Nathan returned to his desk, pressing a button on his phone. Claire, clear my morning schedule. He fixed Anne with a penetrating stare. Let's discuss terms. For the next 2 hours, they negotiated like seasoned business partners. Anne learned that Howard Sinclair's conditions were specific. Marriage, within the month, maintained for a minimum of 2 years, with regular public appearances to prove the relationship's authenticity. In return, Anne would receive her $2 million immediately, with an additional monthly stipend for appearances and expenses. You'll need a new wardrobe, Nathan said, as if discussing the weather. A new car. We'll have to relocate you to a suitable address. I keep my job at the restaurant, Anne insisted. At least for now, it's important to my mother. A ghost of a smile touched Nathan's lips. Admirable loyalty, but it might complicate our narrative. Take it or leave it, Anne said, surprised by her own boldness. Nathan studied her for a long moment, then extended his hand. We have a deal, Miss Carter. As Anne shook his hand, she noticed his grip was slightly too tight, his palm slightly too damp. This man, for all his power and poise, was as trapped as she was. One more thing, Nathan said as she turned to leave. There will be no romance, no confusion about what this is. Anne met his gaze one final time. Trust me, Mr. Sinclair. Love is the last thing on my mind. But as she left the tower and stepped into the bright morning sun, Anne couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just made a deal with the devil, or perhaps become the devil herself. 3 days after making a deal that would change her life forever, Anne found herself in a boutique that didn't display price tags, never a good sign. The personal shopper Nathan had assigned her, a razor-thin woman named Victoria, circled like a fashionable vulture. No, absolutely not, Victoria muttered, snatching a dress from Anne's hands. You're going to be a Sinclair. Everything you wear sends a message. Anne caught her own reflection in one of the boutique's many mirrors. She barely recognized herself after hours of improvements. Her hair expertly styled, her nails perfectly manicured, her makeup subtle but flawless. The engagement ring on her finger, a massive diamond that felt more like a shackle than a symbol of love, caught the light and threw tiny rainbows across the walls. The engagement party is in 2 days, Victoria continued, thrusting another dress at her. Every society photographer in Boston will be there. We need to transform you from, she gestured vaguely at Anne's entire being, this into someone worthy of the Sinclair name. Anne gritted her teeth. I didn't realize the Sinclair name had such specific fashion requirements. Everything has requirements in this world. And darling, Victoria's smile didn't reach her eyes. Speaking of which, Nathan needs you at the tower by 7. Howard wants to meet his future granddaughter-in-law. Anne's stomach clenched. She hadn't expected to face the family patriarch so soon. Tonight? Don't worry, I'll have you ready." Victoria's tone suggested this might require divine intervention. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of designer labels and beauty treatments. By the time Anne's driver, another surreal addition to her new life, dropped her at Sinclair Tower, she felt like an actress preparing for the role of her life. The private elevator opened directly into Howard Sinclair's penthouse office, a space that made Nathan's look modest by comparison. The old man stood at the window, his reflection ghost-like against the darkening sky. Despite his age and the oxygen tank beside him, he radiated authority. "Grandfather," Nathan said, rising from one of the leather chairs, "this is Anne." Howard turned, his sharp eyes scanning Anne from head to toe. "So this is the woman who captured my grandson's heart." His tone suggested he believed nothing of the sort. "It's an honor to meet you, Mr. Sinclair," Anne managed, accepting his frail but firm handshake. "Sit," Howard commanded. "Both of you." They settled into chairs before his massive desk, and Anne felt the weight of generations of power and privilege pressing down on her. Howard didn't speak immediately, instead shuffling through what appeared to be a detailed background report on her life. "A waitress," he said finally, "from a failing restaurant." He looked at Nathan. "Hardly the match I expected." "Anne is more than her current occupation," Nathan replied smoothly. "She's intelligent, dedicated, and she understands family loyalty." "Indeed." Howard's gaze fixed on Anne again. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what made my grandson choose you out of all the eligible women in Boston?" Anne felt Nathan tense beside her. They hadn't prepared for this level of direct questioning. But something in Howard's skeptical tone sparked her defiance. "Perhaps you should ask, what made me choose him?" she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "Money and status aren't everything, Mr. Sinclair. Your grandson is kind, thoughtful, and sees beyond social barriers. That's rather rare in your circles, isn't it?" A heavy silence followed. Then, unexpectedly, Howard laughed, a rough sound that triggered a bout of coughing. Nathan moved to help him, but the old man waved him away. "She has spirit," Howard wheezed. "I'll give her that." The meeting concluded shortly after, with Howard's seemingly reluctant blessing. As they rode down in the elevator, Nathan released a long breath. "That was unexpected." "Was it terrible?" Anne asked. "Actually, it was impressive." A hint of genuine admiration colored his voice. "Few people stand up to him like that." The elevator doors opened to the lobby, now empty except for a man adjusting equipment near the security desk. As they passed, he looked up, and Anne saw Nathan freeze mid-step. The man was striking in an artistic way, tousled dark hair, intense eyes, and a camera hung around his neck. But it was the look that passed between him and Nathan that caught Anne's attention. A split second of raw emotion before both men schooled their features. "Nathan," the photographer said softly. "Ethan." Nathan's voice was carefully neutral. "Working late? Just finishing a shoot for the building's new security materials." Ethan's eyes moved to Anne, then to her engagement ring. Something like pain flickered across his features. "Congratulations. I heard the announcement." "Thank you," Nathan replied, stiffly. "Anne, this is Ethan Blake. He does occasional contract work for the company." Anne felt the weight of unspoken history in the air. She extended her hand, and Ethan's grip was almost too firm, as if he was trying to communicate something through the contact. "We should go," Nathan said. "The driver's waiting." Outside, the night air was thick with humidity and tension. Anne waited until they were in the car before speaking. "So that's him, isn't it? The real reason you agreed to this arrangement?" Nathan stared straight ahead. "I don't know what you mean." "I told you I'd keep any secret," Anne reminded him gently. "I meant it." For a moment she thought he wouldn't respond, then almost inaudibly, "Yes, that's him." Anne watched the city lights blur past her window, thinking of the look that had passed between the two men. She'd promised herself this would be just business, just a means to an end. But seeing that moment of genuine emotion made her realize how many hearts were actually at stake in their charade. "Your secret's safe with me," she said finally. "But Nathan, are you sure this is what you want?" He turned to her, his expression carefully composed once more. "What I want stopped mattering a long time ago. We all have our roles to play." As the car carried them through the nighttime streets of Boston, Anne couldn't help but wonder what other roles and what other secrets she would have to learn to play in this high-stakes performance. The Sinclair family's private ballroom at the Fairmont Copley Plaza seemed designed to make ordinary people feel small. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors, while Boston's elite moved through the space like practiced dancers in an elaborate performance. Anne stood at Nathan's side, her hand tucked into his elbow, wondering if anyone else could hear her heart thundering against her ribs. "Smile," Nathan murmured, his lips barely moving. "Lucas is watching," and maintained her practiced expression as she glimpsed Lucas Montgomery across the room. Nathan's cousin cut an imposing figure in his tailored tuxedo, his dark eyes tracking their every move. Even from a distance, she could sense his suspicion. "He's been cornering the staff," Nathan continued, nodding graciously to passing guests. "Asking questions about how we met, when we started dating, testing for inconsistencies." "Good thing we rehearsed our story," Anne replied through her smile. They'd spent hours perfecting their meet-cute tale, a chance encounter at a charity gala followed by a whirlwind romance. Simple enough to be believable, vague enough to avoid specific dates that could be fact-checked. "Speaking of rehearsal," Nathan said, turning her slightly, "Howard's about to make the official announcement. Remember, look adoringly at you. Blush at appropriate moments and try not to throw up from nerves," Anne finished. "Got it?" The ghost of a genuine smile touched Nathan's lips. "You're getting better at this." Before she could respond, Howard Sinclair's voice boomed through the ballroom, amplified by strategically placed speakers. "Friends, family, distinguished guests, if I could have your attention." The crowd obediently quieted. Howard stood on a small raised platform, oxygen tank discreetly positioned behind him, his presence commanding despite his physical frailty. Nathan guided Anne toward the platform, their movements choreographed during yesterday's rehearsal. "As many of you know," Howard continued, "I've long hoped to see my grandson settled before." He paused meaningfully, patting his chest. "Well, let's just say I'm not getting any younger." Polite laughter rippled through the crowd. Anne felt Lucas's gaze boring into her back. "Imagine my joy when Nathan finally found someone worthy of not only his heart but the Sinclair legacy." Howard gestured grandly toward them. "Please join me in celebrating the engagement of Nathan Sinclair to Miss Anne Carter." Applause filled the space. Nathan turned to Anne, and she saw the silent Q in his eyes. Rising slightly on her toes, they'd practiced this too. She met him for a kiss that was technically perfect and emotionally empty. More applause, a few appreciative whoops from the crowd. "How touching," a smooth voice said as they parted. Lucas Montgomery had materialized beside them, champagne flute in hand. "Though I must say, cousin, you've kept this romance remarkably quiet. I don't recall you mentioning Anne even once before the engagement." "Some of us prefer privacy, Lucas," Nathan replied coolly. "We can't all live our lives on page 6. Privacy is one thing." Lucas's smile was razor-sharp. "Secrecy is another." He turned to Anne. "Tell me, my dear, how exactly does a waitress from South Boston end up at a charity gala?" Anne felt Nathan tense beside her, but she'd prepared for this. "My mother's restaurant catered the event," she said smoothly. "I was helping manage the staff." Though I'm surprised you're so well informed about my background, Mr. Montgomery. Should I be flattered by your interest? Lucas's smile faltered slightly. Just looking out for family interests. How thoughtful, Nathan cut in. If you'll excuse, as I believe my fiancée promised this dance to Howard. They moved away, but Anne could still feel Lucas's calculating stare. On the dance floor, Howard proved surprisingly spry, leading her through a simple waltz while guests looked on approvingly. He suspects something, Howard said quietly, his tone conversational but his eyes sharp. Anne missed a step. I'm sorry. Lucas, he's like a dog with a bone when he thinks he's found a weakness to exploit. Howard's grip tightened slightly. I suggest you and Nathan be very careful. Mr. Sinclair, Please, Howard interrupted. Let's not insult each other with denials. I've built my empire on reading people, my dear. Whatever arrangement you and Nathan have made. Well, let's just say I have my own reasons for allowing it. The music ended before Anne could respond. Howard stepped back, bowing slightly, his public smile firmly in place. Welcome to the family, my dear. Try not to let Lucas destroy you. And the rest of the evening passed in a blur of introductions and carefully rehearsed small talk. Anne's cheeks ached from smiling, her feet screamed in their designer heels, and her mind raced with the implications of Howard's words. Did he know? Everything? Just pieces? Was this some sort of test? Near midnight, she finally escaped to a quiet balcony, needing a moment away from the performance. The cool night air was a blessing on her flushed skin. Quite a show, a familiar voice said behind her. She turned to find Ethan Blake, camera in hand, watching her with an unreadable expression. I didn't know you'd be here, Anne said carefully. I'm covering the event for Boston Society magazine. He lifted his camera. Mind if I get a shot of the blushing bride-to-be? Before Anne could answer, Nathan appeared in the doorway. The tension between the two men crackled like electricity before a storm. Anne, Nathan said, his voice tight. The car's waiting. She moved to join him, but Ethan's quiet voice stopped her. You know he'll never love you, right? Anne turned back, meeting Ethan's pained gaze. I know exactly what this is, Mr. Blake. The question is, do you? In the car ride home, neither Anne nor Nathan spoke. The weight of their deception, of Howard's cryptic warnings, of Lucas's suspicions, and of Ethan's broken heart, hung between them like a heavy curtain. Finally, Anne broke the silence. Your grandfather knows. Yes, Nathan replied, still staring out the window. He always did. Then why? Because Howard Sinclair never does anything without multiple motives. Nathan turned to her, his expression haunted. And we just became pieces in whatever game he's playing. Anne thought of Lucas's predatory smile, of Ethan's wounded eyes, of Howard's knowing look. She'd entered this arrangement, thinking it was a simple business transaction. Now she realized they were all actors in a much larger drama, and no one had given them the full script. The morning after the engagement party, Anne tied on her waitress apron at Carter's corner as if nothing had changed. But everything had. The engagement ring caught the fluorescent kitchen light, drawing curious glances from the staff. Pablo, their longtime cook, kept shooting her concerned looks over the grill, while their regular customers whispered behind their menus. Annie! Linda emerged from the office, newspaper in hand. The Boston Herald's society page featured a photograph of Anne and Nathan at last night's party. Beneath the headline, Sinclair heir to wed local restaurateur's daughter. I can explain, Anne began, but Linda cut her off with a fierce hug that smelled of coffee and cinnamon rolls. My baby girl, Linda whispered, pulling back to examine Anne's face. Why didn't you tell me you were dating Nathan Sinclair? All this time I thought you were working extra shifts, and instead, her eyes welled with tears, I'm just so happy for you. The guilt hit Anne like a physical blow. She'd prepared for her mother's suspicion, even anger. But this pure, Joy was infinitely worse. "Mum, The kitchen doors burst open as Victoria swept in, looking thoroughly out of place in her Chanel suit. "And darling, what are you doing here? We have the wedding planner meeting in an hour, and you're still in—" She gestured dismissively at Anne's uniform. "That—" Linda's smile dimmed slightly. "I'm sorry, you are?" "Victoria Ashcroft, personal brand manager for the Sinclair family." She handed Linda a business card with 2 manicured fingers. "I'm here to collect your daughter. So much to do, you understand." "But my shift," Anne protested. "Has been covered," Victoria interrupted smoothly. "Nathan's arranged for temporary staff to help out while you focus on more important matters." She turned to Linda. "Mrs. Carter, we'll need to schedule some time to discuss your role in the wedding. The mother of the bride has certain expectations to meet." Anne watched her mother's face fall slightly. Linda touched her faded apron self-consciously. "Of course. Whatever Anne needs." "Mom," Anne started, but Victoria was already steering her toward the door. "The car's waiting, dear. We're already late for the florist." The next several hours passed in a whirlwind of wedding preparations. Anne found herself nodding mechanically at discussions of color schemes and table settings, her mind still back at the restaurant with her mother's crestfallen expression. "Focus, dear," Victoria chided as Anne picked at her salad during their working lunch. "The Sinclair wedding will be the social event of the season. Everything must be perfect." "It's all happening so fast," Anne murmured. Victoria's perfectly penciled eyebrows rose. "That's rather the point, isn't it?" Before Anne could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. "Emergency. Meet me at the tower, now." "I have to go," Anne said, standing abruptly. "Family matter." Victoria's protest followed her out the door, but Anne was already rushing to the waiting car. 20 minutes later, she found Nathan pacing his office, his usual composure notably absent. "Lucas hired a private investigator," he said without preamble. "They've been interviewing staff at every major charity event from the past year, trying to prove we're lying about how we met." "Can they?" Anne asked, sinking into a chair. "Not directly, but they're getting close. Too close." Nathan ran a hand through his hair. "And that's not all. Ethan." The door opened, and Walsh hurried in, his face grave. "We have a situation." He dropped a manila envelope on Nathan's desk. "These were just delivered to my office." Nathan opened the envelope with shaking hands, and photographs spilled across his desk. Anne's breath caught. They showed Nathan and Ethan together, at restaurants, entering hotels, sharing intimate moments they clearly thought were private. The most recent couldn't have been more than a month old. "Lucas's investigator found these too," Walsh said grimly. "He's demanding a private meeting." "Blackmail," Nathan said flatly. "He wants control of the Chelsea waterfront development," Walsh confirmed, "in exchange for his silence." Anne studied the photographs, seeing the genuine happiness in Nathan's expression as he looked at Ethan. It was nothing like the carefully composed smile he wore in their engagement photos. "We have to tell your grandfather the truth." "That's not an option," Nathan snapped. "The moment Howard learns I'm—" He stopped, swallowing hard. "Everything I've worked for would be gone. The company, the foundations, all of it." "So we fight back," Anne said firmly. "Lucas isn't the only one who can gather information." Both men turned to stare at her. "What do you mean?" Walsh asked carefully. "Lucas has spent years cultivating a specific image, right? The responsible cousin? The viable alternative to Nathan?" Anne leaned forward. "No one's that perfect, not in this world. Let me do some digging." "You?" Nathan's tone was skeptical. "I've spent years serving drinks to Boston's elite. You'd be amazed what people say when they think you're just part of the furniture." Anne met his gaze. "Trust me." After a long moment, Nathan nodded. "Do it, but be careful. Lucas is dangerous when cornered." That evening, Anne finally returned to Carter's corner. The dinner rush was over, and Linda was alone in the kitchen doing prep work for tomorrow. "Mom," Anne said softly, "can we talk?" Linda looked up, her eyes tired but warm. "Always, sweetheart." Anne moved to help with the prep, falling into their old rhythm of working side by side. "I'm sorry about Victoria today. This whole thing, it's not what I wanted for you." "Oh, honey," Linda set down her knife. "I'm your mother. All I've ever wanted is for you to be happy." She paused. "Are you happy?" Anne thought of the photographs on Nathan's desk, of Lucas's threats, of all the lies piling up around them. But she also thought of the relief in her mother's eyes when the bank had suddenly stopped calling, of the restaurant's bills marked "paid in full," of the future she'd secured for her family. "I'm doing what needs to be done," she said finally. It wasn't quite a lie. Linda cupped Anne's face in her flour-dusted hands. "Just remember who you are, baby girl. All their money and parties and rules, don't let them change your heart." Anne leaned into her mother's touch, fighting back tears. In trying to save one world, she'd become entangled in another. And somewhere in between these two realities, she was in danger of losing herself entirely. The oak room at the Fairmont had seen its share of Boston secrets, whispered over expensive Scotch and white tablecloths. Tonight, Anne sat at the bar in a designer dress that still felt like a costume, watching Regina Burns hold court at her usual corner table. The 60-something socialite had been Lucas Montgomery's executive assistant for 15 years before her unceremonious retirement last spring. "Another martini for the lady," Anne murmured to the bartender, sliding her American Express black card across the bar, another surreal addition to her new life. Regina's third drink of the evening arrived promptly, and Anne noted how the woman's carefully maintained facade had started to slip. "Time to make her move. Mrs. Burns?" Anne approached the table, champagne flute in hand. "I'm Anne Carter, Nathan Sinclair's fiancée. I couldn't help but notice you dining alone." Regina's eyes narrowed slightly, but social conditioning won. "Out. Please join me, and call me Regina." She studied Anne over her martini. "I've read about you in the papers. Quite the fairy tale romance." "Speaking of fairy tales," Anne settled into the chair opposite her, "I've been learning so much about the family history. Lucas has been particularly attentive in sharing stories." Regina's perfectly painted lips tightened. "Has he now?" He's been so helpful with the wedding planning, though sometimes I wonder if he misses his old executive assistant. He mentioned you were like family." The change in Regina's expression was subtle but unmistakable. "Did he?" She took a long sip of her martini. "How nice of him to remember me, especially after everything." "Everything," Anne echoed innocently. 3 hours and 2 more martinis later, Anne slipped into the back of her waiting car, her phone filled with voice recordings and her mind racing with information. She found Nathan waiting in his penthouse office, despite the late hour. "Lucas has been embezzling from the family foundation," she announced without preamble. "Regina has proof, documentation, transfers, all of it. He's been siphoning money into offshore accounts for years." Nathan looked up from his laptop. "Can we trust her?" "She kept receipts." Anne sank into a chair. Literal and metaphorical. Lucas forced her retirement when she confronted him about it, threatened to ruin her reputation, make it look like she was the one stealing. She's been waiting for a chance to take him down. "This could work," Nathan mused, then noticed Anne's expression. "What else?" Anne hesitated. "There's more. About Howard." "Tell me." "Lucas has been manipulating Howard's medication schedule. Regina overheard him instructing the night nurse to adjust things, make Howard seem more confused, more dependent. He's been playing a longer game than we realized." Nathan's face hardened. "Son of a bitch." "We should tell Howard," Anne said. "Not yet." Nathan stood, moving to the window. We need to be strategic about this. Lucas still has those photos of me and Ethan. If we move too soon, then we get the photos back first. Anne joined him. At the window, Regina mentioned Lucas keeps a safe in his office. She knows the combination. Nathan turned to her, surprise evident in his expression. You're getting good at this. Turns out, I have a talent for corporate espionage. Anne said dryly, Lucky you. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, but his eyes remained troubled. Anne, what I'm asking you to do, it's not what you signed up for. I signed up to help save my family's legacy. You signed up to protect yours. She met his gaze steadily. The methods might have changed, but the goal hasn't. Before Nathan could respond, Anne's phone buzzed. A text from Linda. Honey, Victoria scheduled us for wedding dress shopping tomorrow. I know it's fancy, but I want to be there. Is that okay? Reality crashed back in. Here she was, plotting corporate espionage, while her mother was excitedly preparing for a wedding that was nothing but an elaborate lie. I should go, Anne said, suddenly exhausted. Victoria has me booked for another 12 hours of wedding, planning tomorrow. Wait! Nathan caught her arm as she turned to leave. Be careful with Lucas. If he suspects we're onto him... I know. Anne managed a small smile. I'm not the naive waitress I was 2 weeks ago. No, Nathan agreed softly. You're not. The car ride home was quiet, giving Anne too much time to think. She'd entered this arrangement prepared for the lies she'd have to tell, the role she'd have to play, but now she was uncovering real crimes, plotting to break into offices, recording secret conversations. When had this become her life? Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Linda. Found your old ballet slippers while cleaning today. Remember when you used to say you'd dance at your wedding? You were so sure it would be the most magical day of your life. Anne pressed her forehead. Against the cool window, watching the city lights blur past, she thought of her mother's excitement, of Regina's bitter revelations, of Nathan's haunted eyes when he looked at Ethan's photos. So many people's happiness hanging in the balance. The car pulled up to her building, a luxury apartment Nathan had insisted on to maintain appearances. The doorman tipped his hat as she passed, and Anne wondered if he too was someone's spy, reporting her comings and goings to Lucas or Howard, or who knew who else. In her apartment, she kicked off her heels and poured herself a glass of wine, trying to sort through the evening's revelations. Her phone buzzed one final time. Nathan, Walsh is drawing up papers for Regina tomorrow. Once we have her official statement, we move on the safe. Ready? Anne stared at the message for a long moment before replying, Ready. She caught her reflection in the window. Designer dress, perfect makeup, power pose. 2 months ago, she'd been worrying about inventory orders and tip percentages. Now she was at the center of a high-stakes game of corporate manipulation and family betrayal. The naive waitress was indeed gone. The question was, who was she becoming instead? The bridal boutique was exactly as ostentatious as Anne had expected, all crystal chandeliers and champagne flutes, with price tags that could fund a small business. Linda Carter stood in the midst of it all, touching silk and lace with reverent fingers, her face glowing with maternal pride. I've been saving for this day since you were born, Linda confided as they waited for Victoria to return. With the first round of dresses. I mean, not for this exact boutique. She laughed nervously. But I always wanted you to have your perfect dress. Anne's throat tightened. Mom, you don't have to. I know. The Sinclairs are handling everything. Linda straightened her department store blazer. But I'd like to contribute something, even if it's just a veil or Mrs. Carter. Victoria swept back in, trailed by assistants laden with white fabric. While we appreciate the gesture, The Sinclair family has a very specific vision for this wedding. Anne's image is crucial to... Anne's phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. Regina signed the affidavit. Walsh has her safely tucked away at the Cape House. Lucas's office sweep starts in 30 minutes. Are you ready with the distraction? Actually, Anne interrupted Victoria mid-lecture. I'd love my mum's input. She has amazing taste. She turned to Linda. Remember that vintage shop in Cambridge you used to take me to? The one with all the beautiful antique veils? Linda's face lit up. Oh, Madame Rousseau's. They had the most exquisite French lace. Victoria, Anne said sweetly, would you mind terribly taking my mother to look at it? For inspiration? I know it's not quite up to Sinclair standards, but it would mean so much to us. Victoria's carefully maintained smile twitched. But we have the Vera Wang appointment in an hour, and Lucas specifically requested... Lucas? Linda asked. Your fiancé's cousin. Why would he care about the dress appointments? He's very involved in family matters, Victoria said smoothly. In fact, he's meeting with the wedding planner right now to discuss the seating arrangements. Perfect, Anne thought. Lucas was exactly where they needed him to be, away from his office. She turned to her mother. Please, Mom, I'll try on dresses while you're gone, take lots of pictures. After a few more minutes of careful manipulation, Anne managed to hustle Victoria and Linda out the door. The moment they left, she pulled out her phone. They're heading to Cambridge. You've got at least 2 hours. Nathan's response was immediate. Walsh's team is moving in now. Stay available in case we need a backup distraction. Anne turned back to the remaining boutique assistant, a young woman who looked thoroughly overwhelmed by the morning's drama. Shall we start with the mermaid silhouettes? For the next hour, Anne dutifully tried on wedding gowns while keeping one eye on her phone. She sent her mother periodic photos of herself in various dresses, each message a tiny dagger to her conscience. The assistant had just finished lacing her into a spectacular ball gown when her phone buzzed again. Problem. Lucas is heading back to the office. Need immediate intervention. Anne's heart raced. She looked at herself in the mirror, a vision in white silk and crystals. Every inch. The Sinclair bride-to-be. Perfect. I'm so sorry, she told the assistant, gathering up her skirts, but I've just got to run to Sinclair Tower. Wedding emergency. I'll come back for the dress, I promise. Before the stunned woman could protest, Anne was hurrying out the door, designer wedding dress and all. Her driver took one look at her outfit and wisely said nothing, navigating quickly through Boston traffic. She swept into the Sinclair Tower lobby like a white-clad whirlwind, drawing every eye. The security guards, used to her presence by now, barely blinked as she headed for the executive elevator. Lucas was just entering the building when she intercepted him. "Oh, thank God!" she exclaimed, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I need your help." He stopped short, taking in her appearance. "Anne, what are you—" "The wedding planner is completely ruining everything," she continued, grabbing his arm. "The flowers, the menu, it's all wrong. Nathan's in meetings all day, and you're so good at this stuff." She batted her eyes. "Please, just look at the plans with me." She could see him weighing his options, refusing to help his cousins. Distressed fiancé, in full view of the lobby, not the image he wanted to project. "Of course," he said finally, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Let's use the conference room on 12. Anne steered him to the opposite elevator from his office, texting behind her back, "Got him, top of the hour." For the next excruciating 45 minutes, she kept Lucas occupied with endless questions about table settings and wine pairings, playing up her role as the overwhelmed bride-to-be. He grew increasingly impatient, checking his watch, but maintained his solicitous facade. Finally, her phone buzzed one last time. "Clear. Get out of there." "Oh," Anne stood abruptly. "I'm supposed to be back at the boutique. Mom will be so worried. Thank you so much for your help." She left Lucas looking slightly dazed, no doubt wondering what hurricane had just blown through his afternoon. In the car, she finally let out a shaky breath and checked her messages. "Nathan, we got everything. Photos, documents, the whole trail. Meet me at the penthouse." Anne looked down at herself, still wrapped in thousands of dollars of wedding gown. Another message came through, this one from her mother. The vintage shop was lovely, but Victoria didn't seem impressed. "Coming back to the boutique now. Where are you, sweetie?" Reality crashed back in. She was sitting in the back of a luxury car, wearing a wedding dress meant for a marriage that would never be real, having just helped execute corporate espionage against one of Boston's most powerful families. "Back to the boutique," she told her driver. "Quickly, please." She had just enough time to change back into her own clothes before Linda and Victoria returned. Her mother's face fell slightly when she saw her. "Oh, you're not in a dress," Linda said. "I was hoping—" "Don't worry," Anne forced a smile. "I'm saving the best ones to try on with you." As she followed her mother back into the forest of white dresses, Anne's phone buzzed one final time. "Nathan, you were amazing today. Thank you." She slipped the phone back into her pocket, watching her mother excitedly sort through veils. Everything they were doing, the lies, the schemes, the manipulation, it was all meant to protect the people they loved. So why did every thank you feel more and more like an accusation? Howard Sinclair's private study felt like a room frozen in time. Dark wood paneling absorbed what little daylight filtered through heavy curtains, and the air hung thick with the smell of leather-bound books and aged scotch. Anne stood slightly behind Nathan's shoulder as Walsh laid out their evidence on Howard's massive desk. "These are very serious accusations," Howard said, his voice betraying nothing as he examined the documents. "And you're certain of their authenticity?" "Regina Burns provided a sworn affidavit," Walsh confirmed. "The financial records speak for themselves. Lucas has been systematically embezzling from the foundation for years." Howard's fingers traced the edge of a particularly damning bank statement. "And the medical records? Proof that he's been interfering with your care," Nathan said quietly. "The night nurse confirmed everything." A heavy silence filled the room. Howard reached for his oxygen tank, taking a measured breath before speaking. "You've done well, bringing this to me." His sharp eyes fixed on Anne. "Both of you." Anne felt a chill at his tone. There was something calculating in his gaze that reminded her uncomfortably of Lucas. "However," Howard continued, "you haven't shown me everything, have you?" Nathan tensed beside her. "Sir?" Howard opened his desk drawer and withdrew a familiar manila envelope. "Lucas was kind enough to deliver these himself this morning, along with some very interesting theories about your arrangement." Anne's heart stopped as Howard spread the photos across his desk. Nathan and Ethan's private moments now laid bare in the harsh light of day. She instinctively reached for Nathan's arm, feeling the tremors running through him. "Grandfather," Nathan started, but Howard held up a hand. "Did you really think I didn't know?" The old man's voice was surprisingly gentle. "About Ethan? About this elaborate charade with Anne?" Nathan swayed slightly. "How long?" "Years." Howard's expression softened further. "I'm not quite the rigid, traditionalist Lucas painted me to be, though I must admit I played into that perception rather effectively." Anne found her voice. "The inheritance condition, the marriage requirement, you knew we'd orchestrate this." "I knew my grandson would find a creative solution." Howard's lips twitched, "though I didn't anticipate quite how perfect that solution would be." "I don't understand," Nathan said. "If you knew about Ethan, about everything, why put us through this?" Howard stood slowly, moving to the window. "Lucas has been circling this company like a vulture for years. I needed to know if you were ready, not just to run the business, but to outmaneuver him, to protect what matters. He turned back to them. And you've exceeded my expectations magnificently. By lying to you? Nathan's voice cracked. By hiding who I am? No, son. By showing me exactly who you are. Howard moved to stand before Nathan. You found a way to satisfy the letter of my demands while protecting those you care about. You chose an ally who proved both loyal and capable. And when faced with a genuine threat to this family, you handled it with intelligence and discretion. Anne watched Nathan struggle to process this revelation, decades of fear and shame warring with this unexpected acceptance. But now, Howard continued, we have a decision to make. These photos, the evidence against Lucas, we hold all the cards. The question is, how do we play them? Before anyone could respond, the study door burst open. Lucas stood in the doorway, his usual polish shattered by rage. You went into my office. You think you can? He stopped short, taking in the scene before him. Uncle Howard, I can explain. Can you? Howard's voice turned to steel. Explain. The embezzlement? The medical manipulation? Or shall we discuss your attempted blackmail of my grandson? Lucas's face went pale. They're lying. Whatever they told you is extensively documented. Howard settled back behind his desk. Did you really think I wouldn't figure it out? That I would hand over my life's work to someone who would steal from sick children through our own foundation? Everything I did was for this family, Lucas snarled. While you coddled him, groomed him to take over despite his proclivities, I was protecting our legacy. No, Howard said quietly, you were destroying it. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Lucas lunged forward, reaching for the documents on Howard's desk. Nathan moved to intercept him, but Anne was closer. She grabbed the heavy crystal paperweight from the desk and swung it up, catching Lucas's temple with a sickening thud. He crumpled to the floor as Walsh rushed in with security. Well, Howard said into the stunned silence that followed, I believe that settles the matter of succession rather definitively. He looked at Anne with new appreciation. My dear, you continue to surprise. Later that evening, Anne sat with Nathan in his penthouse, both still processing the day's events. Lucas was being treated at a private hospital, after which he would face criminal charges. Howard had already begun the process of removing him from all family enterprises. I still can't believe it, Nathan said for perhaps the 10th time. All these years, hiding who I was, and he knew. He understood. He's smarter than we gave him credit for, Anne replied. He was testing you, testing us both. And now? Nathan looked at her uncertainly. The marriage charade. We don't have to continue it. Anne thought of her mother's excitement, of the wedding plans, of the complex web they'd woven. Maybe we see it through, just for appearance's sake. Give Howard time to adjust the inheritance terms quietly. But they both knew she was really asking for time to figure out how to unravel their deception without destroying the relationships they'd built. Nathan's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his expression softening. It's Ethan. Go, Anne said gently. Talk to him. Figure out what you want now that you can actually have it. After Nathan left, Anne stood at his window, looking out over the city she'd grown up in, but somehow never really known until now. Somewhere out there, her mother was probably showing off wedding photos to customers at the restaurant, planning her daughter's perfect day. The truth would have to come out, eventually. But tonight, in this moment of victory, Anne allowed herself to feel something like pride. She'd helped expose real wrongdoing. She'd protected people she'd come to care about. Maybe the lies that had brought her here could be forgiven in light of the truths they'd revealed. Her phone buzzed, a message from Howard. You've proven yourself a true Sinclair, my dear, whether you marry into the family or not. Anne smiled slightly. It wasn't exactly a compliment, but she understood now what he meant. In this world of power and privilege, of secrets and lies, sometimes the greatest truth lay in knowing exactly who you could trust. She looked down at her engagement ring, still sparkling in the city lights. The game wasn't over yet, but at least now they were playing it on their own terms. Autumn had come to Boston almost overnight, painting the public garden in shades of gold and crimson. Anne sat on a bench near the swanboats, watching Ethan and Nathan walk along the lagoon's edge. Even from this distance, she could see the careful space between them, the way they occasionally reached for each other before remembering where they were. A week had passed since the confrontation with Lucas. The Boston Globe had run a carefully worded story about his medical leave from Sinclair Enterprises, while quiet investigations into the foundation's finances continued behind closed doors. Howard's team had managed to keep the more sordid details out of the press, but whispers still circulated through society's upper echelons. Anne's phone buzzed with another text from Linda. "Honey, the florist needs final approval on the centerpieces." And the wedding planner called about the menu tasting. She closed her eyes, letting the crisp October air fill her lungs. Every day the lie grew heavier. Every excited message from her mother, every wedding detail that needed attention, it all felt like stones being added to her shoulders. "They look happy," a familiar voice said. Anne opened her eyes to find Howard Sinclair settling onto the bench beside her, his ever-present oxygen tank tucked discreetly by his feet. "Should you be out in this weather?" she asked, noting his labored breathing. "My dear, I've spent too many years letting fear of death keep me from living." He nodded toward Nathan and Ethan. "Something my grandson is finally learning as well." They watched in companionable silence as Nathan helped Ethan adjust. His camera lens, their heads bent close together, sharing a private laugh. "We need to end the engagement," Anne said quietly. "Yes," Howard agreed, "but carefully. There are reputations to consider, feelings to protect." Anne turned to him. "You mean my mother?" "Among others. The press will speculate, of course. Society loves nothing more than a scandal." He patted her hand. "But perhaps we can give them a different story, one that preserves dignity all around." "What did you have in mind?" "A mutual decision to part ways. You, the humble girl who realized she wasn't ready for the pressures of our world. Nathan, the understanding fiancé who values your happiness above all." Howard's eyes twinkled. "We'll even let you keep the settlement. You've more than earned it." Anne watched Nathan and Ethan start another loop around the lagoon. "And what about them?" "Time," Howard said simply. "We give the dust time to settle. Let Nathan's breakup fade from the headlines before he's seen with anyone else." He smiled slightly. "I may be more progressive than Lucas painted me, but I'm still pragmatic about public perception." A cool breeze stirred the fallen leaves around their feet. "I have to tell my mother the truth," Anne said. "Not everything, but enough. She deserves that much." "Yes, she does." Howard's expression softened. "You know, I've been watching you these past months. The way you've navigated our world while never losing sight of your own. It's quite remarkable." "I'm not sure remarkable is the word for what I've done," Anne replied. "I've lied, manipulated, helped orchestrate Lucas's downfall, and in doing so, protected a good man's happiness, exposed genuine wrongdoing, and saved your family's legacy." Howard stood slowly, gathering his oxygen tank. "The world isn't black and white, my dear. Sometimes the most moral choice is the one that looks questionable from the outside." He began to move away, then paused. "Oh, and Anne, there's a position opening up in our corporate communications department. Someone who understands both sides of the fence, as it were. Think about it." Anne watched him go, then turned back to observe Nathan and Ethan. They'd stopped walking, standing close together near a cluster of maple trees. Ethan reached up to brush a leaf from Nathan's hair. The gesture so intimate, it made Anne's chest ache. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was Nathan. "Dinner tonight? We should talk about next steps." She typed back, "Your place, 7 p.m. I'll bring wine." The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of wedding cancellations, each call carefully worded, each vendor generously compensated for their trouble. Victoria was surprisingly understanding, though Anne suspected Howard had already briefed her on the situation. That evening she arrived at Nathan's penthouse to find him cooking. The domestic scene caught her off guard. Nathan Sinclair in jeans and a sweater, stirring pasta sauce while Ethan set the table. "I hope you don't mind," Nathan said, gesturing to Ethan. "He should be part of this conversation." "Of course." Anne uncorked the wine she'd brought, noting how naturally the two men moved around each other in the kitchen. "It's nice to see you both comfortable." Ethan poured the wine. "It's nice to be acknowledged." There was no bitterness in his tone, just simple truth. Over dinner, they planned their public separation. Howard's suggested narrative would work, they agreed. Anne would give a single, tasteful interview to Boston Magazine, expressing gratitude for her time with the Sinclairs. But acknowledging the lifestyle wasn't for her. "What about the restaurant?" Ethan asked. "Once the engagement ends, won't people question how your mother suddenly paid off all those debts?" "I've thought about that," Nathan said. "We'll say it was a business investment. The Sinclairs backing. A local landmark. It fits with our company's image." Anne pushed her pasta around her plate. "I still have to tell her, my mom, not everything, but—" "Do you want me there?" Nathan offered. "When you tell her?" "No." Anne met his eyes. "This is something I have to do alone." Later, as she was leaving, Ethan walked her to the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for giving him the courage to be himself." "I think Howard did that," Anne replied. "I was just the catalyst." "You were more than that." Ethan hesitated. "You know, I hated you at first, the idea of you, but watching you fight for him, protect him, I realized you loved him too in your way." Anne thought about Nathan's quiet strength, his loyalty, the way he'd trusted her with his deepest truth. "I suppose I did, just not the way everyone thought." That night, she sat at her kitchen table, composing and recomposing the words she would say to her mother. Every version felt inadequate, incomplete. How do you tell someone that a lie told out of love had somehow led to deeper truths, that sometimes the wrong choices could lead to right endings? Her phone buzzed one final time. "Howard, remember, my dear, the truth doesn't always need to be cruel, to be honest." Anne looked around her luxury apartment, at all the trappings of a life she'd borrowed for a while. Tomorrow she would begin, dismantling the fantasy. But tonight she would allow herself to be proud of the reality they'd built from it. The breakfast rush at Carter's Corner had ended, leaving that peculiar quiet that settled between meals. Anne stood in the doorway of the restaurant's small office, watching her mother sort through invoices with a contentment she hadn't shown in months. The weight of the paid bills and cleared debts had lifted years from Linda's face. It made what Anne had to do even harder. "Mom?" Her voice caught slightly. "Can we talk?" Linda looked up, her smile fading as she registered Anne's expression. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Anne closed the office door and sat in the worn chair across from her mother's desk. The familiar smell of coffee and baked goods wafted through the air, and for a moment she was transported back to childhood conversations in this very spot. Homework troubles, first crushes, dreams of the future. "The wedding," Anne began, then stopped, started again. "Nathan and I—" "Oh, honey." Linda reached across the desk to take her hand. "Are you having pre-wedding jitters? That's completely normal. When I married your father—" "It's not real." Anne blurted out, "The engagement, it was an arrangement." The silence that followed felt endless. Linda's hand withdrew slowly from Anne's. "I don't understand," she said finally. Anne took a deep breath. "Nathan needed to be engaged by a certain date to secure his inheritance. I needed money to save. The restaurant, we made a deal." The words tumbled out now, unstoppable. "The engagement was supposed to be temporary from the start. We're going to announce the breakup next week." Linda stood abruptly, moving to the small window that overlooked the kitchen. All of it, the whirlwind romance, the society parties, the wedding plans, her voice cracked. "You lied to me about everything." "Not everything," Anne said desperately. "The restaurant really was in trouble. The debts really were crushing us. I did it to save what Dad built, to protect our family's legacy." "By selling yourself," Linda turned back, her eyes bright with tears. "By becoming someone's, what, hired fiancé?" "It wasn't like that." Anne stood too, needing her mother to understand. "Nathan is a good man. He was trapped too, in his own way. We helped each other." "And the money?" Linda's voice hardened. "All our debts mysteriously paid off. That was part of the deal." "Yes," Anne lifted her chin. "And I'd do it again. We were drowning, Mom. The bank was going to take everything. So you took their money instead. Pretended to love their son. Let me plan a fake wedding." Linda pressed her hands to her face. "Do you have any idea how foolish I feel, showing everyone the society page photos, telling our customers about my daughter's fairy tale romance?" "Mom, please, did you ever stop to think," Linda interrupted, "that maybe I would have rather lost the restaurant than watch my daughter sell herself to these people?" The words hit Anne like a physical blow. "That's not fair. I did this for us." "No, sweetheart," Linda's voice softened with sadness. "You did this because you thought I was too weak to handle losing the restaurant. You did this because somewhere along the way you decided you had to protect me instead of trust me." Anne sank back into her chair, the truth of her mother's words washing over her. All these months she'd told herself she was being strong, being practical, but had she really just been afraid? Afraid to watch her mother face reality, afraid to let go of her father's dream, afraid to trust that they could survive starting over. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I couldn't bear to see you lose everything. Not after Dad." Linda moved around the desk and pulled Anne into her arms. The familiar scent of vanilla and coffee enveloped her as Anne broke down, months of tension and guilt pouring out in deep, racking sobs. "Oh, my brave, foolish girl," Linda murmured, stroking her hair. "The restaurant, the house, they're just things. You're my everything. And watching you twist yourself into knots living this lie, that's been harder than losing any business could ever be." They held each other for a long time, the morning sun casting patterns through the dusty office window. Finally, Anne pulled back, wiping her eyes. "The money," she said. "They're converting it to a business investment. The Sinclairs will be silent partners in Carter's Corner. No strings attached." Linda nodded slowly. "And Nathan, will he be okay?" Anne smiled slightly, thinking of Nathan and Ethan in the park. "Yes, I think he's finally going to be very okay." "Good." Linda touched Anne's cheek. "And you? What do you want, sweetheart, now that you don't have to be anyone's perfect society bride?" For the first time in months, Anne let herself really consider the question. "Howard offered me a job in corporate communications, and I think I might be good at it. All these months navigating their world, learning to speak their language while remembering where I came from." "You found your own path," Linda finished, "just not the one any of us expected." Later that evening, Anne sat in Howard's study, sharing a rather excellent scotch as they finalized the details of her new position. "Your mother took it well?" he asked. "Better than I deserved." Anne swirled the amber liquid in her glass. She reminded me that sometimes the hardest person to trust with the truth is the one you're most afraid of hurting. Howard's eyes crinkled. Wise woman. She wants to meet you, actually. Said anyone who's going to be a business partner should at least come try the clam chowder. I look forward to it. Howard raised his glass. To new beginnings. Anne clinked her glass against his, thinking of Nathan and Ethan planning their quiet future, of her mother's forgiveness, of the strange and winding path that had led her here. To the truth, she countered, however complicated it might be. The Boston magazine photographer kept adjusting the lighting, trying to capture exactly the right mix of dignity and approachability that the story demanded. Anne sat perfectly poised on a leather chair in the Sinclair Tower lobby, her media training already showing in the careful angle of her chin, the gentle set of her shoulders. Just a few more, the photographer called out. We want to convey strength, but also vulnerability. If you only knew, Anne thought, maintaining her practiced smile. The magazine article would run tomorrow. Modern romance. Why Boston's most talked about engagement ended in friendship instead of marriage. The headline had been crafted by Anne herself, her first official act in her new role as Associate Director of Corporate Communications for Sinclair Enterprises. That's perfect, the photographer said, finally lowering his camera. Miss Carter, you're a natural. Anne has always understood the power of image, Victoria commented from the sidelines. After the initial shock of the broken engagement, she'd become one of Anne's strongest advocates for the communications position. She'll do well in this world. As the photography team packed up their equipment, Anne's phone buzzed with a message from Nathan. Just saw the advance copy. You made us both look good. She smiled, typing back. That was the point. How's Provincetown? Nathan and Ethan had escaped to the Cape for a few weeks, letting the engagement story play out in the press without them. Howard's team had carefully leaked photos of Nathan looking pensive on beach walks, setting up the narrative of mutual growth and amicable parting. Beautiful, peaceful. Ethan's teaching me to surf. I'm terrible, Anne could picture it. Nathan Sinclair, always so controlled, falling into the waves while Ethan laughed from the shore. Good. You deserve some joy. Miss Carter? Walsh appeared at her elbow. Howard would like to see you before the board meeting. She found the old man in his study, looking more energetic than she'd seen him in weeks. The investigation into Lucas's activities had led to improved medical oversight, and Howard's health had stabilized significantly. The article is perfect, he said without preamble. Just the right touch of bittersweet reflection while maintaining everyone's dignity, although I particularly enjoyed the subtle hint about Nathan focusing on his humanitarian work. Setting up his future public image, Anne explained. When he eventually comes out, it won't seem like a scandal, just a natural extension of his commitment to human rights and social progress. Howard's eyes crinkled. Masterfully done. Now about the board meeting, are you ready? Anne smoothed her blazer, a power suit that would have seemed like a costume just months ago, but now felt like armor. The presentation's prepared, though I'm not sure all the board members will be thrilled about taking PR advice from Nathan's ex-fiancée. Let them doubt, Howard said. You've survived worse than a few skeptical old men. The board meeting went better than expected. Anne's presentation on modernizing the company's public image, emphasizing community investment, environmental responsibility, and social progress, was met with cautious approval. The fact that she could speak authentically about both the corporate world and the community's perspective proved compelling. Afterward, she went to Carter's Corner for the evening rush. The restaurant was thriving under its new partnership with Sinclair Enterprises, though Linda had insisted on maintaining complete operational control. How'd it go? Linda asked as Anne tied on an apron. Despite her new corporate job, she still helped out during busy times, keeping her feet firmly planted in both worlds. They liked it. Even old Mr. Peterson, who I thought would have a heart attack when I mentioned LGBTQ plus inclusive marketing. Linda laughed, then grew serious. I saw the advance copy of your article. You were very kind to everyone. That's the job, Anne said, then corrected herself. No, that's who I want to be. Someone who can find the truth without destroying people in the process. The dinner rush kept them busy, but Anne noticed something different in the air. The regular customers who'd known her since childhood treated her with a new kind of respect. Not because she'd almost married into the Sinclair family, but because she'd emerged from that world with her integrity intact. Near closing time, her phone buzzed with an email from the Boston Globe. They wanted to run a follow-up piece on the Sinclair Foundation's new initiative supporting small businesses in changing neighborhoods. The reporter specifically requested Anne as their point of contact. Look at you, Linda said, reading over her shoulder, managing the message, shaping the narrative. You've found your calling. It's strange, Anne replied, starting to craft her response. All those years wondering what I wanted to be, and it turns out I had to pretend to be someone else to figure it out. Linda squeezed her shoulder. Sometimes the longest road leads exactly where you need to go. Later that night, Anne stood at her apartment window, looking out at the city she'd learned to see in an entirely new way. Her phone lit up with one final message, a photo from Nathan showing him and Ethan silhouetted against a Cape Cod sunset, their hands clasped between them. The caption read, "Thank you for helping me find my truth." Anne smiled, thinking of the article running tomorrow, of the foundation work ahead, of all the stories yet to be shaped and told. She'd entered the Sinclair world thinking it was just a role to play, a means to an end. Instead, she'd found her voice, and with it the power to help others speak their truth. Her reply was simple. Thank you for helping me find mine. Winter had transformed the Boston Common into a wonderland of crystalline branches and fresh snow. Anne pulled her cashmere coat, a remnant from her brief tenure as a Sinclair bride-to-be, tighter against the December chill as she crossed. The park, the path to Carter's Corner, was more familiar than ever, even if she now walked it in designer heels instead of waitress shoes. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and the warmth hit her like an embrace. The restaurant was packed. The renovation Howard had insisted on funding, having transformed the space into something both modern and comfortably familiar. The old booths had been reupholstered, the lighting updated, but the heart of the place remained unchanged. "There's my corporate warrior," Linda called from behind the host stand. She looked elegant and confident in the new uniform she'd designed. For the staff, another small but significant change. "Just dropping off the final numbers," Anne said, pulling out a folder. "The foundation's investment has already shown a 30% return. The board is thrilled." "Howard's coming for a dinner tonight?" Linda replied with a knowing smile. "I'll tell him in person." Why, the unlikely friendship that had developed between Linda Carter and Howard Sinclair had surprised everyone except Anne. They'd bonded over their shared love of classic films and strong opinions about clam chowder. And now Howard was a regular at the restaurant's quieter dinner hours. "Speaking of Howard," Anne said, "how's the Foundation's new youth program coming along?" Linda's eyes lit up. "We've already got 10 students signed up for the culinary training scholarship. Kids who couldn't afford cooking school getting a real chance." She squeezed Anne's hand. "Your father would have loved this." The mention of her father didn't hurt the way it used to. Instead, Anne felt a warm certainty that they'd honored his legacy in a way that went beyond just saving the restaurant. They'd transformed it into something that could help others build their own dreams. "Miss Carter," one of the newer waitresses approached. "There's a reporter from the Herald on the phone. Something about the Sinclair Foundation's LGBTQ+ youth initiative?" Anne checked her watch. "Perfect timing. I'm meeting Nathan and Ethan to discuss the press release. She kissed her mother's cheek. Save me some of Pablo's lasagna for later. The drive to the Sinclair Tower felt different now that she worked there legitimately. The security guards greeted her with genuine warmth, and the elevator ride to the executive floor carried none of the tension it once had. She found Nathan in the conference room, looking relaxed in a way she'd never seen during their fake engagement. Ethan sat beside him, camera equipment spread across the table. He'd been hired as the Foundation's official photographer, his artistic eye helping to document their community impact. "The Herald's sniffing around," Anne announced, settling into her chair. "They want the exclusive on the youth center launch." "What's your take?" Nathan asked, and Anne felt a flush of pride at his trust in her judgment. "I say we give it to them, but we lead with the broader initiative: educational support, job training, housing assistance. Then we fold in the LGBTQ+ focus as one component of a comprehensive program." "Sneaky," Ethan commented approvingly. "Make it harder for conservatives to object without looking like they're against helping kids in general." "I learned from the best," Anne replied, nodding toward Howard's office. Through the glass walls, she could see the old man on the phone, looking more energized than he had in years. Nathan reached for Ethan's hand, their fingers intertwining naturally on the conference table. No hiding, no shame, just two people in love. "How's the wedding planning going?" Anne asked. "Small ceremony in Provincetown this spring," Ethan said. "Just family and close friends." "Speaking of which," Nathan added, sliding an envelope across the table, "we'd be honored if you'd be my best woman. Yiday." Anne opened the invitation, emotion tightening her throat. "Are you sure? Won't it be awkward, having your ex-fiancé in the wedding party?" "You were never really my fiancé," Nathan said softly. "You were something much more important, the person who helped me become myself." Later that evening, Anne returned to Carter's Corner to find Howard and Linda deep in conversation at the corner booth. They were poring over architectural plans, something about expanding the culinary training program to a dedicated space next door. "Ah, Anne," Howard called out, "join us. We're plotting a small empire here." As she slid into the booth, Anne caught her reflection in the window. She saw a woman who had learned to move between worlds without losing herself, who had turned a deception into something genuine and valuable. The ghost of the desperate girl who had walked into Sinclair Tower all those months ago had been transformed, like a butterfly emerging from a chrysalis of lies into something unexpectedly beautiful and true. "Actually," she said, pulling out her tablet, "I have some ideas about expanding the program regionally. There are other restaurants, other communities that could benefit from this model." Howard's eyes twinkled. "Always thinking bigger, aren't you?" "You taught me that," Anne replied, then looked at her mother. "And you taught me what to do with that ambition, how to use it to help others." Linda reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "And to think all this started because you were trying to save a little family restaurant." "No," Anne said, looking between these two people who had helped shape her new path. "It started because I was brave enough to walk into that tower and make an outrageous proposal. Everything else, that was just life showing us a better way." Outside, snow began to fall again, adding fresh layers to the city's winter blanket. Inside Carter's Corner, surrounded by the warmth of food and family and purpose, Anne felt the last pieces of her story settling into place. She hadn't gotten the fairy tale ending everyone had expected. She'd gotten something better, a true one. Howard raised his water glass. "To new chapters." "To truth," Linda added. "To both," Anne said, clinking her glass against theirs. "And to all the stories yet to come." The restaurant hummed with happy voices, the kitchen sent out delicious aromas, and through the window, Boston's lights twinkled like stars in the falling snow. In the end, Anne realized, The greatest love story hadn't been about romance at all. It had been about finding the courage to be authentic, the strength to help others do the same, and the wisdom to recognize that sometimes the most precious truths emerge from the most unlikely deceptions. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.